So in our last video, we defined what a species was. But part of evolution is the process in which we produce all of these different groups of organisms, all of the variety of life that we have on Earth. Now it's estimated that there's anywhere from 5 to 100 million species on Earth. No one knows for sure, but based on the number that we have and the rate at which we discover them, this is sort of a guess in how many are actually present. But how do we decide when something becomes a new species? Now, becoming a new species is a process called speciation. Speciation is just the process by which one species splits into two distinct species. And then, of course, each of those species could later split into other species. And then we have the beginnings of Darwin's tree of life, where we have groups splitting off and becoming new species. No matter how many species there are, this process of speciation has two main phases. The first phase is reproductive isolation. So something has to happen to reproductively isolate two groups. And then once they are reproductively isolated, remember our biological species concept, this idea that you're considered a species if you can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So once we have stopped that, once we've blocked the ability to reproduce genetically viable offspring, we have produced new species. And then each of those species is going to continue along their own path of evolution, and here we have genetic divergence. So we have the event which blocks the breeding of these two species, and then each species goes along their own evolutionary pathway. Now this might be natural selection occurring on either one of them, adapting those populations to their own specific environments and habitats, and it could be any one of the other evolutionary processes that we talked about in chapter 4, chance events, gene flow, those sorts of things that can shape a population along with natural selection. So let's talk about the first phase, the reproductive isolation. So reproductive isolation occurs in two major ways. The first one is called allopatric speciation. Patric meaning country, like patriotic, allo meaning different. So this term allopatric means that two groups are isolated, their populations are isolated from one another. Now usually this is a geographic barrier. So essentially we're saying they're in two different countries or two different regions. So you can think of this as a mountain range, you can think of this as a river, it can be a glacier, it can be an ocean, pretty much anything that can separate, physically separate these groups can lead to allopatric speciation, or the development of species that are separated by a geographical barrier. Now, allopatric speciation is the most common one, because if you're a little tiny squirrel, you can't necessarily cross a river or a mountain range. If you're a bird, maybe you can, but if you're this little squirrel, you can't. And so allopatric speciation can sort of be relative as well. One geographical barrier might block squirrels, but it might not block another. So it just depends on the organism and the barrier. Allopatric speciation is a prezygotic barrier. This means that fertilization can't happen because the organisms are physically unable to interbreed. And then, of course, once we have our reproductive isolation, that geographic isolation is going to contribute to the separation and allow each of those populations to diverge on their own. So if we have this initial population, a common ancestor of these antelope ground squirrels, these guys live on the north and south rim of the Grand Canyon. So the Grand Canyon is pretty big. If you're a squirrel, you can't jump across it. It's going to take you a long time to walk across it, and you probably can't cross the water in the middle. So here we've got our geographical barrier. This is supposed to be the Grand Canyon. So the Grand Canyon formed, and these squirrels, these antelope squirrels, were isolated on either side. Now they can't interbreed, so now there's no gene flow between these two groups. Over time, this group begins to diverge along its own evolutionary pathway through natural selection, genetic drift, lack of gene flow, or gene flow with other squirrel populations on this side. And then this population over here on the right-hand side also begins to move along its own evolutionary tract until you reach the point of no longer being able to interbreed and eventually the production of two new species, the Harris antelope ground squirrel and the white-tailed antelope ground squirrel. Another good example of allopatric speciation is the Galapagos Island finches. So these are the guys that Darwin was looking at. So individual finches from the Ecuadorian mainland would have flown or been blown onto these various islands. Now we have a water barrier in between. So we have a geographical barrier that's going to separate these finches. Because they're far apart, finches tend not to travel in between them and in between them and the mainland. And so this allowed each of these groups of finches on the individual islands to become specifically adapted to the food in their habitat. So if you recall from our last chapter, we have different beak sizes based on the different seed food sources, seed and other food sources, insects, bugs, things like that, that these guys will feed on. And so once they were reproductively isolated, they went down their own path of becoming unique to the specific environments that they were found on. So interestingly, there's only one species of mainland finch. If you want to pause for a minute and think about why that is. If you paused or even if you didn't, the reason that there's only one is that all of these finches on the mainland continue to interbreed, and so there's lots of gene flow within that finch population, keeping them all very similar. The lack of gene flow between these ones is going to allow them to travel down their own evolutionary pathways. The other type of reproductive isolation that can come about is called sympatric speciation. So sympatric speciation is speciation that occurs without geographic isolation. This means that two populations can actually encounter one another in a given area, which means there's the potential for them to interbreed because they are actually co-located physically. Now this is very rare in vertebrates. And the reason is that they're mobile, they can move around. And so that constant gene flow through closely positioned populations is going to allow them to remain more similar. And so they're not going to be as likely to go down their own evolutionary pathway. There's one really good example of this though, and this is the apple maggot fly. So this is a little fly that hangs out on apples. It eats apples and hawthorns for food, and it also uses them for mating. So this is a behavioral and habitat situation, but we ended up with a closely related blueberry maggot. So this blueberry maggot was an apple maggot that basically switched habitats. So even if there were blueberry and apples in the same region, they began sort of isolating themselves from the apple maggot population. So even though they could interbreed, they didn't because they were using blueberries for their food source and their mating environment. This allowed for each of those populations to diverge into their own species. And now we have the apple maggot and the blueberry maggot. But as I said, sympatric speciation is not very common among vertebrates. There's a tree frog that, different example, forget about the tree frogs. Sympatric speciation, though, is common among plants, and it's one of the big ways that plants become reproductively isolated from one another. So in plants, a common mechanism of speciation is sympatric speciation. Now, allopatric speciation in plants would occur, could possibly occur, because plants can't move. So if any barrier comes between two plants, there's the potential for them diverging. But do keep in mind that with plants, you also have pollinators and things like that, animals that can pollinate or move seeds to other areas. So allopatric speciation may or may not occur with plants either. But sympatric speciation, going back to that, is quite common in plants, and it occurs by something called polyploidization. So this is a genetic change that leads to multiple copies of an entire set of chromosome. So let's look at what's going on here. Ploid, remember that word from our genetics unit, that means a set of chromosomes. Poly means many, so many sets of chromosomes, and then ization is sort of process, the process by which you get different numbers of your chromosomes. So remember from our genetics unit, we were looking at organisms that were diploid and produced haploid gametes. So diploid means we have two copies of each set of chromosomes. Polyploidy means many or more sets, so more than two sets of chromosomes. This is really common in agricultural plants, oats, cotton, tobacco, wheat. For example, the most common bred wheat, Triticum aestivum, is a 6N. That means that it has 6 copies of each type of chromosome. It actually has 2 sets from each of 3 different species. You can ignore that typo there. That should say 3, not thress. But so you can see that this can get quite complicated if you have multiple copies of entire sets of chromosomes. Strawberries and bananas are often also polyploid. Many of the fruits that have been selected over time for specific qualities and other agricultural things are polyploid. So polyploidization can occur by 2 different processes. Now remember, this is sympatric speciation. So this is speciation that's occurring when 2 plants or multiple plants are found in the same area. So the first scenario in which you can get sympatric speciation by polyploidy is by an error in cell division. So if we look at this plant gamete here, it has 3 types of chromosomes, 2 copies each. Now, if it produces an abnormal gamete where a cell division occurs and something happens, a non-disjunction or something similar happens, and you don't separate your chromosomes completely, and then that gamete fertilizes a correct one, you've now ended up with a sterile offspring. So this is what would normally happen. And those offspring are not going to be sterile, because if you look at these guys, they're not going to produce fertile offspring with the correct genetic information in each of the cells. But what happens if you have 2 polyploid gametes combine? Then you end up with an individual that has extra copies of each one. Now we have, instead of having 2 copies of each type, we have 4 copies of each type of chromosome. Now this results in speciation because this individual can no longer mate with this original parent or even the normal gamete, because their chromosomes are not going to separate correctly during meiosis. So in this case, we sort of have an instant reproductive isolation. Now sometimes, if you have this individual and it can self-fertilize, then you can produce a new generation of offspring that have these multiple sets of chromosomes. Now you get instant reproductive isolation because they can only reproduce with themselves. They can't reproduce with any of the parent plants. They can't reproduce with any of the normal plants that would result from basically their brothers or their sisters, that would result from a union between normal gametes of the same plant. So polyploidy can also occur by hybridization. So remember that hybridization is the offspring of two different species, so two parents from different species. So in this case, we have one species with 3 types of chromosomes, another species with 2 types of chromosomes. Let's say fertilization actually happens. When this happens, we have a new chromosome complement. Now this individual can no longer breed with either one of the parental species because their chromosomes are not compatible. So we have now had a new population that is produced because of hybridization. So produced because 2 different species donate donate their chromosomes. Now this leads to a hybrid individual. Now this hybrid individual could reproduce asexually, it could self-fertilize, and in this case we would have a new species because it's isolated from either one of the parent populations.